All right. Looks like we are live on this fungicide webinar. I'm excited to do this with three great presenters. My name is Colin Shear. I'm the PFR Operations Manager for Beck's Hybrids. And today we're going to talk a lot about just different fungicides. Anything from fungicide timing, disease trends from the last 20 years, just anything and everything foliar fungicides. Before we get going here, I just want to remind everyone that's on this webinar to please mute. That way there is no interference as the presentation is going on. And then if you guys have questions, there's two ways that you guys can ask questions. Number one being you can text me directly. You'll see my phone number at the bottom of the screen here. I am in Salina, Kansas today, and in this building, there's not a ton of cell service. So if you text me, I will text you back saying got it or whatever. That way you know your question's been received. If you do not get a text message back from me, throw your question in the comment bar there, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation. And so, like I said, I am so excited for this fungicide webinar. You know, whether you're evaluating this year's fungicide plan or looking ahead, you know, right? We hope that you guys will walk away with some practical takeaways for your guys' operations. And so we got three great presenters. First off, we're going to start with Dr. Matt Montgomery. He's our Beck's Agronomy Education Lead. He hails out of Central Illinois. Second, we're going to have Andrew Cottrell. He is our Practical Farm Research Location Lead out of our El Paso, Illinois location. And then lastly, bringing up the rear is going to be Clayton Stuffelbein. He is our PFR agronomist, and he hails out of Lewistown, Illinois. And so here, right out of the gate here, we're gonna get Matt going here, and he's going to talk all about history of fungal foliar diseases and how disease occurs and what we need to do to manage that. So, Matt, I will turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, again, we're getting right up against the fungicide application time of things, and so we thought it would be really useful for us to go through that whole efficiency conversation. That's, like Colin said, what we'll kind of wrap things up with. Andrew has put together, looked at 20 years worth of PFR data on fungicides and has looked at trends within that data, and we're going to talk about that. And then my part, as Colin said, is really trying to get to know your enemy better, because I always think that's important as you're going into battle. We're going to be entering into that battle against fungal foliar disease in corn. And so that's the portion that I'm going to talk about today. Before we begin, I think it's really important for me to acknowledge three people that took some time out of their busy schedules to kind of review the material that we're going to present. And so Dr. Boris Camiliti at University of Illinois, Dr. Mandy Bish at University of Missouri, and Dr. Darcy Tolenko at Purdue, they all carved out time to give us ideas about how to tweak this. And so one of the things I'm going to say down there at the bottom is, if the message is clear and on point, those three people, send them a note and say thank you. Where it's otherwise, that's going to fall on me. That's going to be the short-balled agronomist that kind of missed the point there. This is the outline for today. So the first thing we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk about it briefly, is going to be the mission-critical protection on the plant. And again, we're going to run through that real quick just to give you kind of a 30,000-foot view of what we're trying to do. And then we're going to talk about how the fungal foliar disease story changed. And this is a good example of why being able to have those three reviewers chime in was really important, because they brought up, as I presented this, that Matt, you're going to talk about how the story has changed for you. And that's going to catch a lot of the Beck's footprint. But the Beck's footprint is pretty broad anymore. You know, it's going from Wyoming over to Ohio, going from up in Minnesota all the way down into the southern part of the Mississippi Delta. And your story won't be everybody's story. So I'm going to qualify that as the way the story has changed for me in my career. And it will catch most of you that are listening online. There'll be a few people where the story is a little bit different, but I think the general idea, the story that's being set up, is still applicable. And as I do that, as I talk about how we seem to have more pathogens commonly observed in the countryside, one of the questions that's going to get generated in your mind is, well, now what do I do? I've got to have a battle plan going into the season, a plan A. What does that initial battle plan need to look like? how do I distill that down into something that's actionable? And we're going to begin to try and hit that by talking about where diseases overwinter. So we can begin to see a slight prioritization of which diseases might be more common and which ones maybe are a little less common. Kind of going along with that, we're going to spend some time talking about life cycles of these diseases. And that's not just kind of agronomic, nerdy information. We're going to actually talk about, as you look at those life cycles, a certain component, a cluster of things in those life cycles that can be exploited to our benefit. And it explains why management is sometimes the way it is, or what we're trying to do with fungicides and those kind of things. Then we're going to finally get back full circle, and we're going to talk about which disease do we manage? What do we build our plan A, our initial battle plan going into the season around? And then we do have some space for questions, but we're going to probably hold off questions to the very end of the presentation for all three of us. And I and Andrew and Clayton will be more than glad to do our best to answer the questions that you have. So this is point one, and it's nothing dramatic here. It's just trying to underline the most important part of the plant for us to protect. You know, we want a healthy plant overall. We would love to maintain overall plant health. But mission critical, the part of the plant for corn that really drives grain fill is ear leaf and above. And so if we compromise that part of the plant, if it gets hit by lesions from fungal foliar disease, we're going to see a yield hit. And we want to maintain the green on that as long as possible. Clayton's going to bring up in his portion of the presentation that also, though, if we kind of have that upper part of the plant fall apart, sometimes we can see some stalk cannibalization that can result in some harvestability issues that come along. So really important for you just to fix in your head the most important part of that corn plant for us to protect is ear leaf and above. That's mission critical for yield. So let's talk just a little bit about how the story has changed. And again, we'll kind of pigeonhole this as the way the story has changed for me in my career. If you're from the West Central Illinois area and from our Bex district and that part of the world, some of these points will sound familiar to you. We kind of rolled some of these out to you in the past, but I'm going to do it again here. I'll kind of put the cards on the table and give you an idea of how old I am. So I'm hitting mid-50s now. I was in college in the early 90s up to the mid-90s. And, you know, going into the early to mid-90s, there were lots of diseases that could appear. But as far as commonly being observed, we didn't seem to have a lot of stuff that we ran into. There had been a blip, a pretty significant blip back in the early 70s where some foliar disease had really taken it out of the crop. But we ran about 20 years without fungal foliar disease, without blight on the upper part of the plant being a huge point of conversation. As I stepped out of college and I got into my career, things began to change. And one of the things that changed throughout a good portion of this footprint that Bex covers is that we became much more conscious that we needed to do things to conserve soil. We wanted to make sure we kept soil where it was, that we didn't have as much loss as what we had been looking at up to that point. And so minimized tillage, a lot more residue on the soil surface began to increase. And that was a really important thing. Actually, there probably are some lessons that we need to go back to on that front to conserve soil that's worth us remembering today. But one of the side effects, there's always side effects to the things that we do, is that by maintaining residue on top of the soil surface in a way we hadn't really done at a level up to that point, as we created kind of this regional bed of material that allowed diseases to overwinter. It gave them an overwintering site. And the disease that really sprung up, in particular in that kind of 95, 96, 97 period, was gray leaf spot. Some of that has to do with some susceptible hybrids that were out there. It also has something to do with the fact we had more residue for that stuff to overwinter on. Gray leaf spot, many of you are familiar with, you know, those small rectangular lesions on the leaf. Even when those kind of grow together, you oftentimes can pluck those leaf off the plant, hold that up to the sunlight, backlight it, and you'll still be able to catch hints of those rectangle shaped lesions even after they've grown together. works its way from the bottom of the plant up, can be a really significant yield reducer. Now, one of the things that we appreciated about gray is that it kind of had a narrow set of kind of weather dynamics that it really needed to show up. I've got on the bottom part of the screen a bar that says relative humidity. And so this is kind of the range of relative humidity that we tend to run into through the bulk of this footprint from about late June to about early August. So just think of that as the range. So left is low, and you can see on the right, things get darker, it gets more humid. On the bottom, I have temperatures, and that also is the range of temperatures that we tend to run into from that late June to early August period. And the gray bar in there is the portion of that relative humidity spectrum that we run into and the portion of the temperature spectrum that gray tends to like. I'm just representing that graphically rather than throwing out numbers. And one of the things you might appreciate as you're looking at that is if you're back in the mid 90s where this seemed to be the disease that appeared, other things could, but they didn't appear in the way that gray leaf spot did, that we might run into a year with some pretty low relative humidity. And that would be a year that maybe we didn't see gray leaf spot. You know, we have to have a susceptible host, we have to have the pathogen, and we have to have the right environment. And if I hit the wrong environment, gray leaf spot didn't show up at such a yield reducing way. Also, if you looked at temperatures, if I got really extreme on the temperature side of things, or if I got really extreme on the lower end of that temperature scale, that was kind of not that favorable bounds for gray leaf spot. And we would kind of hit an environment that was less prone to it. So even though we had gray there, we had these seasons that sometimes just didn't set up well for gray leaf spot to appear. And it meant we had seasons where upper plant disease didn't really show up very well. If you've been around for a while, you know how that story changed in a lot of the footprint. And that is as we hit the mid 2000s, in particular in a good portion of the Midwest, all of a sudden northern corn leaf blight became just a little bit more common. Northern's a little different than gray. It forms these cigar-shaped lesions. Even when those grow together, you'll still see these dark cigar-shaped lesions on that dead tissue. And so it's easy to kind of pick that disease out. It can be equally devastating to gray leaf spot. It became more common. And if you look at the relative humidity chart there on the bottom, you begin to catch a hint of the issue. We had gray, and we had a portion of the temperature spectrum that wasn't really favorable for gray. Then northern became a little bit more favorable, and northern could seize the opportunity where gray leaf spot couldn't, in particular when temperatures were a little cooler and it could appear. So suddenly a few more seasons are at play for us to see some kind of foliar disease on the upper part of the plant. Northern had been around for a while. It's just that it became more common. A real new, truly new player that hadn't appeared before was tar. And that happened in the latter 2010s. And most of you are pretty familiar with what that looks like. It looks like you took a paintbrush, dipped it in pitch, and just flicked it on the plant. And you get these tiny little tar-shaped like lesions, these kind of dark lesions on the plant. Remember, those of you that are familiar with it, those of you that maybe aren't, wet your finger, just put it in your mouth, wet it with some spit. You can't rub these lesions off. If it rubs off, it's not tar. If you can't rub it off, it is tar. And we began to appreciate that could be a pretty yield devastating disease. And notice there too, even though tar likes some higher relative humidity, at least by textbook, more of the relative humidity ranges that we ran into year to year was at play with tar. You catch this hint of more seasons being at play for some kind of foliar disease. And then over the last few years, we've had southern rust appear, again, through a good portion of the Beck's footprint in a way that it hadn't appeared before. We'd always seen southern rust, but usually southern rust had come in kind of after yield was set. We just kind of noticed it and didn't worry about it. Over the last several years, it's come in a little earlier, enough that it can kind of take the stuffing out of yield just a little bit. And notice there too, in particular, when you look at temperature, you know, the higher temperatures have kind of been out of play for gray and northern and tar. Those real high intense temperatures were at play for southern rust. My point is you catch a sense for many of us of how the story changed. 30 years ago, it was kind of gray leaf spot, and that meant I had some years that weren't ideal for gray leaf spot. And those were years that we didn't really see a lot of upper plant foliar disease. And we've done some changes in genetics that have helped us out in battling disease, that's for sure. But my point is, if you look at present day, with 4 more common players on the scene, a lot more of the seasons are at play for some kind of foliar disease than what we used to see. If it's not a gray leaf spot year, it very well could be a northern year. If it's not a northern year, it could be a tar year. And if it's not a tar year, every once in a while, we'll see southern rust. And so part of setting up the battle plan for the season ahead, I think, is to fix in your head that more seasons are at play for foliar disease than what we've seen before. More are than aren't in a lot of cases. So I said we went from 1 to 4 players, and that begins to create an issue for you, because we talked about it's important to forge a battle plan going into a season, to have an idea of what your battle might look like, even if it needs to be tweaked along the way. You want a plan A at least. So what do you build that plan A around? And part of answering that is why we're going to talk about overwintering just a little bit. And we're going to briefly mention, and then we're going to come back to this. But keep in mind this point. Of those 4 diseases that we're talking about throughout most of this footprint, gray, northern, and tar are the ones that tend to be able to set up camp, set up house here, wherever here is for most of you, through the winter months. They'll shelter down winter in residue and wait for better conditions the following year. But when we talk about southern rust, which was a big deal last year and caught a lot of attention, southern rust does not overwinter in the bulk of this footprint. And that means it's always having to hitch a ride on wind currents, storm fronts to get back into this part of the world. That means those other 3 diseases, in many ways, year in, if you look at years across the spectrum, if you look at the years that we experience, more often than not, they've got a leg up on southern rust because they're at least starting out here. Southern rust has to hitch a ride to get here. We're going to come back to this idea about what do you build your plan A around in just a little bit, but I want to take a moment now and I want to talk about life cycles of these diseases. We're going to start out with those overwintering ones. So the ones that overwinter in the bulk of the Beck's footprint, and that is gray leaf spot, northern cornleaf blight, and tar. And we could go through each one of these and just take them apart piece by piece by piece. That'd make for a little bit of a long conversation. I'm going to instead approach it this way. I'm going to graphically show you what the life cycles for gray and tar and northern cornleaf blight look like. And I want you to keep your eyes open for how similar these tend to look. And we'll start with gray. If we were going to graphically represent what the gray leaf spot life cycle looks like, this is what it would look like. And you see there's some banana shaped things there just off center down on the bottom. You'll notice that there's a banana shaped thing there on the left hand side of the screen that's laying on the leaf tissue. And there's some little balloon like thing or half balloon like thing that comes out from it. You see that on the left center, and you see that on the right center. And then you see some things that are creating more of those banana shaped things and belting those out. We're going to talk about what those pieces are, but I just want to acclimate your eye a little bit to those structures. Now I'm going to flip up the graph for northern. And while it's different, notice there are some strong similarities. You still have some kind of banana shaped things in the picture. You still have some balloon or half balloon like things in the picture. You still have gray things within the leaf. You still have some things that are producing additional material. Tar is going to look a little different, but there are still some of those similarities. So we don't necessarily have the great big banana shaped things, but we have some kind of smaller, maybe bean shaped things. We have those balloon shaped things. We have those gray things. My point is there's strong similarities in the life cycle pattern for gray and northern and tar. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to explore those similarities. I'm going to use gray leaf spot as our model to kind of talk about all 3. So this is gray leaf spot, the life cycle. This is our disease model that we're going to run with, and I'm going to just break it apart piece by piece. So for all three of those overwintering diseases, remember they're harboring in that residue on the soil surface. And then when conditions get right in season, they belt out spores. And that's what those banana-shaped things are in the picture. And those spores are then moved by wind or rain for gray or northern or tar to leaf tissue. And the spore lands on that leaf tissue. Now, remember we talked earlier, to have a disease, you have to have that susceptible host, you have to have the pathogen, and you have to have the right environment. That means the right temperature, and that also means the right amount of moisture. If we get the right amount of moisture, those little banana-shaped spores will germinate, and they'll send out a little tube. It's called a germ tube. And then in the case of northern, in the case of tar, they form something called an aprosorium. It's kind of like a little bladder. It's a little different for gray. It's a similar but not exactly the same structure. For northern and tar, it forms this little bladder-shaped thing. And that bladder-shaped thing literally inflates with liquid. That's my simple way of describing what it does. It fills with a lot of liquid, and that creates a lot of hydraulic pressure. So it really fills up with this liquid, creates a lot of water pressure. And that hydraulic pressure is literally used to drive what's called an infection peg, that fungus, into the leaf tissue. So sometimes that hydraulic pressure in that bladder is drilling that fungus through a natural opening in the leaf. Sometimes, like with the initial stages of northern, it's literally kind of drilling it right through the leaf material itself so it can get into the heart of the leaf. But you catch a sense, it needs, at least in the case of northern and tar, this bladder filling with liquid to really create a lot of this hydraulic pressure to fuel the entry of that disease. And then the fungus begins to colonize the internal portion of the leaf. It creates these little small fungal hairs, and they begin to devour the cells within the leaf and use their material to fuel the development of more fungal hairs. And eventually it creates some kind of reproductive structure. And that reproductive structure can vary depending on its look, depending upon whether it's gray or depending on whether it's northern or depending on whether it's tar, but they all produce a reproductive structure. The general idea is there. And that reproductive structure produces more of those banana-shaped spores, at least in the case of gray and northern, they're banana-shaped. Those spores land on additional leaf material as wind and rain splash those around. So long as the temperature and moisture are right, it will form that germ tube and that little bladder that inflates with liquid, in the case of northern and we think tar. And it will drive the disease into the plant, colonize it, produce additional reproductive structures that create more spores, and just get this cycle rolling on and on. Now hold on to that. That's not just odd facts. Again, there's a vulnerable state in here that we can exploit, and we're going to use this disease model to go back to that. But I need to take a moment and I need to pull up southern rust because it's a little different. Remember I said northern and gray and tar are overwintering here. Southern we said is not, and there's some other differences, but I also want you to notice how much similarity there is in that life cycle. Here's the life cycle for southern rust. And maybe one of the things you're going to notice is the colors may be a little different in this graphic, but you seem to have that little tube coming out of a spore. You seem to have that little bladder, don't you? And you seem to have those little fungal hairs starting to colonize the internal portion of the leaf. There are similarities to what we saw before. In the case of southern, those spores are blown back up from the south, from overwintering sites way down south. They're blown back up into our part of the world. Those spores land on leaf material. And if we have the right level of relative humidity and leaf moisture, apparently Dr. Tolenko will mention that southern rust apparently doesn't need tons of leaf moisture. Last year in some areas it was fairly dry, and morning dews were enough to get southern rust started. That's enough to germinate that spore. It'll send out a germ tube. It'll form that little bladder that inflates with liquid, and it will drill that fungus into the leaf. And then it produces its own reproductive structure. It looks different than what we saw before, but it will produce a reproductive structure. In this case, it is a pustule, almost like if your kids ever had chicken pox, chicken pox pustule. That chicken pox pustule is full of little viral particles, and when it blows open, it spreads those out. When these blow open, they send out more of those little orange spores. And those spores go back to the leaf, land on the leaf. If we've got those morning dews and the right temperature, the right relative humidity, remember this likes a little higher temperatures, that spore germinates, gets that little bladder that fills with liquid, drives the fungus into the leaf. The process continues all over again. So why mention all that? Well, again, the reason we mention all that is there is a key portion of that life cycle for ol4 that is vulnerable. If we can nip it there, we can stop disease in the field. And that means we're entering into now the conversation around management. And there's really three things that we probably should keep our eye on when it comes to managing these fungal foliar diseases that kind of exploit and hurt that upper portion of the corn plant. And that means we need to talk about hybrid selection. We need to talk kind of generally about the cultural techniques we might engage in to tame down foliar disease. And we need to talk about fungicide application, which is really the focus of today. Hybrid selection. We're going to go back to our disease model. If I could redo this graphic and talk about hybrid selection, I put some kind of graphic that would be a clock that would show the clock slowing down, because that's what hybrid resistance does. What hybrid resistance does is it kind of slows down the pace of this cycle. It slows down the pace of lesion development and sometimes the size of lesion development. If you want to think of it as a basketball game, think of this in some ways as hybrid resistance holding the ball a little bit until the buzzer goes off. And in this case, the buzzer is that we're getting yield established. We want to maintain more green leaf tissue, tame down how much dead leaf tissue is on that plant, and then kind of hold that ball to get as much yield established as possible. That's what hybrid resistance does. And hybrid resistance should, in the majority of cases, be our first step in battling disease. A good example would be if you live in a part of the world where you feel like northern corn leaf blight is the primary disease. It's not like that for a lot of people, but it is for some. Then you probably want to go to a product like 6374 in our lineup because, hey, that northern corn leaf blight score is a 9 on a 1 to 10 scale. That's pretty impressive that it would be a 9. It won't totally eliminate disease, but will sure dramatically slow down the pace of disease development. And that will mean that you hold on to more green longer and set you up for being able to hold on to yield. The foundation is important. Getting a good hybrid when it comes to resistance is something very important to keep our eye on. But let's go back now into that disease model and let's talk about some cultural approaches we might take. And let's talk about that key vulnerability that we want to exploit. The key vulnerability that we want to exploit is what I have the circle around in this picture. If I can ever stop those banana-shaped spores, or if I can stop that little germ tube from coming out in those banana-shaped spores, or in the case of northern and tar, we think, and southern, I can create an opportunities to stop that little bladder from forming, or maybe even that little bladder from filling up with liquid. If I can stop that at that point, any of those three, you know what happens. Everything else that comes after disappears. If I can halt that with, for instance, some care with how I do irrigation, instead of maybe me doing a lot of small irrigation events that constantly keep the canopy wet, that constantly keep humidity high, if I can do larger dose events, in particular, this works with tar, or we think it does. There's some anecdotal evidence that this works with tar. If I can do larger one-dose events rather than constantly keeping things wet, I wind up with a scenario where those germ tubes don't come out very well, that bladder doesn't form very well, and that bladder doesn't inflate very well. And that means I don't have the infection peg that goes into the leaf. That means I don't have those little fungal hairs starting to colonize tissue. If I don't have those little fungal hairs colonizing tissue, it means those reproductive structures don't form. If those reproductive structures don't form, it's not belting out a new batch of spores. Those aren't landing on the leaf, and you kind of get the feel for where this is going. It halts stuff up front. In some ways, think about it a little bit like weed management. In weed management, we try to knock out seeds as much as possible because that halts everything that follows. If I can knock out that spore or germ tube or bladder inflating, that is a really good strategy for kind of taming down the problem in the field. So we can use, for instance, irrigation to do that. Or if we kind of rework soil, I don't know that we want people to do a lot of that, but if we would till residue under, you can see how that in the past reduced places for spores to be produced and reduced the incidence of disease out in the field. The tool that we use a lot is fungicide anymore, and rightfully so. And we're going to talk about some of that here in just a bit. But what fungicide is doing is it's exploiting those vulnerable three. In particular, it's trying to exploit that germ tube coming out of the plant, to knock that out and to stop the formation of that bladder. That's what we're doing with fungicide. And basically, when we use fungicide, we're knocking out that portion, that critical portion, that vulnerability, and it results in the same thing we saw just a bit ago. You have nothing else that follows, and it means you tame down your incidence of foliar disease out in the field. That's the philosophy, the general principle behind fungicide applications. We're trying to get this to happen on the upper part of the plant, so if those spores land, they can't then penetrate the tissue and create the infection. That brings us full circle back to our question about which disease do we manage. So I talked about my part of the world, and I said it kind of catches a lot of what many of you experience. And that is, we went from this world where there was one common player to where it seems like anymore I have 4 more common players. Some of those diseases have always been around. They're just a little bit more common. What do I do with that? I've got to have a plan A going into the season. I've got to have an initial battle plan, even if it has to be tweaked in season. What should my initial battle plan be built around? We're going to get to that, but I need to first remind you that there are tools out there that can help us. So we're going to form an initial battle plan, but we should always keep in mind that battle plan may need to be tweaked. If you go to Crop Protection Network, they have some modeling that's going on there for gray leaf spot and tar. And that's a useful tool that might help us kind of determine if we need to tweak our management, if perhaps we need to tweak the timing of a fungicide application, for instance. Now, a quick note on tools like this. I think modeling is going to be an important tool for us in the future. We're going to want to continue to refine modeling because we're going to hit a point where we're just not going to be able to spray the number of acres that we are. That's going to cause us a lot of issues in the future. And it's also going to cause some cost of production issues for us. And so I think in the future, modeling is going to be super critical. Give us a heads up on if we need to inflate our number of acres that a fungicide is being applied to, or if we need to pull that back. We are in a better place now than we were 10 years ago. I'm eagerly looking forward to the next 10 years where we refine this and make this an even more useful tool for customers to use, for growers to use. The other thing is we literally can monitor disease out in the field. IPM pipe, that's where a lot of our university professionals and industry folks kind of keep updates about what they're seeing in the field. And you can literally go to these sites and see how a disease is developing and begin to catch a sense if your initial plan needs to be tweaked. So they've got a southern corn rust outbreak map that you can go to. If you went there right now, you'd see a bunch of green counties down in Georgia. That just means those counties were scouted, but the disease isn't present. So don't take green as a case of the disease showing up. But you can use this to monitor and get a feel for whether or not you think disease is progressing rapidly and if your initial plan needs to be tweaked for that season. Same thing with tar. We have some tar development that's shown up out in Iowa, down in eastern Indiana. It's been confirmed. It's not necessarily something we need to really get our axle wrapped up around yet, but maybe a few weeks down the road, we'll want to watch what's going on here and see if the plan needs to be tweaked. But for now, present, not necessarily a kind of critical situation where our initial battle plans need to be changed. That gets us back to this question of initial battle plan. I said I have 4 players, so which one of those should we build the initial battle plan around? And let's go back to my conversation about overwintering. But before we do that, let's remind ourselves that this isn't a new dilemma for us. We've always lived in a world where there are a lot of pests that could potentially show up on a crop, but we've always built management around a few key ones that tend to be more likely. We do that in weeds. We do that with water hemp as kind of a driver weed species. And we do that with insects. This is a picture of just a few of the many insects that you could run into in a corn crop. And most of you know, most of the time, we want to keep our eyes open for those, see if we need to tweak our initial battle plan to kind of battle some of those. But for most of us, there's 2 that we're building our insect management plans around, and that's, for many of us, corn borer, and the other one is rootworm, right? Those are more the drivers, and we try to catch the one-offs as they come along. And my point is the same thing applies, I think, with foliar disease. Remember, we have 3 of the 4 that overwinter here. And I said, you got southern that always has to hit your right here. And what that should do for you is begin to put in perspective. Last year was a bad southern year, but it's probably not the disease that my year-to-year plan A should be built around. I want to be prepared to tweak for it if it begins to appear in a big way, maybe shift some applications more to brown silk than tassel time. But it's not the issue that I'm probably going to build around because it shows up occasionally. It has to hit your right here. The other 3 are pretty well rooted. If you go out and you look at the remaining 3, gray, northern, and tar, and you do a lot of scouting, my suspicion is many of you will kind of fall where I do, and that is more seasons than not. It still seems to be gray that I see rather than those other 2. And so a lot of times for me, just intuitively, based on what I see out in the field, I'm kind of building my battle plan around gray leaf spot. The good thing about Bex is we have PFR research that kind of points at the same thing. If you look at return on investment, when we look at PFR proven in our Bex research, it's still that R1 application, that tasseling, silking time application that shows the most return on investment. And that aligns very well with gray leaf spot and gray leaf spot management. It indicates very strongly that for many of us, gray leaf spot is still the driver that we build our management programs around. It's the plan A. And then if we need to tweak it in season, we can. But more seasons than not, we're still going to scout. We're still going to kind of guide management with what's appearing out in the field, and what we're hearing is beginning to get close. But as far as our initial plan going into a season goes, oftentimes shooting for that R1 tassel time application of fungicide is still the best approach because gray leaf spot still seems to be the driver. May change in the future, very possibly could change in the future. But for now, given the data that we have, gray leaf spot is still the driver and is probably where the initial battle plan is better built. With that, Colin, I'm going to step aside here and let Andrew sit down, and Andrew's going to talk about his portion of the presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt. That was very informative. I really thought, some of those illustrations that you had on just how disease enters, the fungal disease enters the plants, that was super, super cool. So next here is going to be Andrew Cottrell. So he really loves diving into data, and he's went back and looked at the last 20 years of PFR fungicide trials and starting to look at the trends, right? Look at the trends on each and every year that we've done PFR proven or PFR fungicide trials, and then he's just going to look into what drives fungicide response in those trials. So Andrew, take it away.
All right, thank you for having me on here today. And yeah, like Colin said, I'm going to spend my portion of this presentation really diving into PFR data. So I am the location lead for our El Paso, Illinois PFR site. I've been here for a little over 2 years now and really enjoyed just diving into this data and looking through it. We have done a lot of research in PFR on this fungicide pass, and we've learned a lot of cool things. And so I want to kind of step through a new way of looking at that data, because we've always kind of presented this data as individual studies, and we're looking at the best fungicide timing or best fungicide practices. We've never really combined a lot of this data into one big data set and analyze that and look for different trends in that data. So that's kind of the new data I'm going to share with you today is just a new way of looking at that old data. So I'm going to just kind of outline what I'm going to step through today. First, I'm going to start off with just talking a little about this data set, how I built it, what is driving the data that I'm going to share with you today. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about kind of overall results of this 20-year data set. I'm going to step through a couple different locations. I know the folks in this call here are maybe from a lot of different locations, so I'm going to share some different locations and the things we see there. Then I'm going to step back and look a little about economics of the fungicide pass. I think that's an important thing to consider as we're making our fungicide application, is not just the yield trends we see, but also economic trends we see. And then lastly, I'm going to finish with response indicators. What I mean by that is, what are the things that we've seen in the data that have pointed to a higher yield response from fungicide? So hopefully what we can learn from this is, what are some of the factors in the field? Maybe that's weather, disease patterns, tillage type. What things can we look at in our field that can point to, Okay, so to kind of step back and describe this data set to you, and maybe the story behind what drove me to build this data set. Like I said, I've been here for a little over 2 years.
Looks like their internet may be glitching a little bit. Here, we will give them a second here to get going here. They are working on it as we speak here. We'll give them just a minute here.
And camera.
I can add extra.
Can you hear me? Can you see the screen? No, you don't.
Are we back?
Mike.
All right. After some minor technical difficulties, we have got it figured out here. So Andrew, take off where you left
All
off.
right. Okay, well, our apologies for the technical difficulties. Hopefully this will hold out here. I'll try to go back to where I was. I think I was just talking about looking through the PFR data here through the years. And basically, as I looked through PFR data, an observation that I made, and as I talked to other agronomists and some of my coworkers and to farmers, is we've got a lot of research showing us how to make that fungicide pass pay the best. But I'm still back at, there's a lot of years where I'm not seeing the fungicide pay at all. And then there's some years where it pays really well. And so I started to, think about how do we know better on the farm? When are we in a year that is this a good decision to make this fungicide pass or is it not? And so that was kind of the goal of putting all this data together is to learn a little bit more about, first of all, over the years, what kind of response have we gotten on average? When we should or shouldn't make this application. Okay, so as I started going back, basically I went starting with the 2025 PFR book. I just started going back in time and looking through these plots. And I guess let me go back here quick. One thing I noticed with a lot of these studies is most of these studies have two treatments in common. They've always got a control with no fungicide applied at all. Then we've got a treatment that's just a fungicide pass at R1, just a standard Veltima or Trivapro, just a standard fungicide pass at R1. And so as I went back through these books, I basically took those two treatments and add them into a massive spreadsheet where I compared this fungicide application to no fungicide. And so this is the data that I collected for each of those sites. The yield difference, I collected some things about that plot, some of the cultural practices, the hybrid that was planted there. In some cases, we had the disease observed in that plot. And then also I went in and added monthly rainfall, humidity, and temperature. So this is all data that I have for each of these data points that we can kind of cross-reference and see how these factors interact with our yield response. So just big picture, stepping back here, I was able to go back all the way to 2005 was kind of the first fungicide trials we had in PFR. So that's going back, we've got 21 years of data here. And over those 21 years, I was able to collect 822 different studies. So we have done a lot of research with fungicide, and we've got 822 different plots where we were testing fungicide, and we had fungicide with and without fungicide in those plots. And I just want to remind you all, this is PFR data, and so this is replicated data points. So I've got 822 plots, but each of those is replicated 3, 4, or 5 times. So it's really strong data. It's collected with good equipment, good practices. So I just really want to emphasize this is a really strong data set that we're looking at here. And over 21 years, overall, our average fungicide response has been 8.2 bushels. So a pretty good response to fungicide over those 21 years. But what's most important here is looking at ROI. And over 21 years, the ROI that we have reported has been $12.23 on average. And I also want to remind us, as we're looking at the PFR book and as we look at ROIs and PFR, this does not include application costs. The reason we don't include the application costs in that ROI calculation is because some of you folks own your own equipment. Maybe it only costs you $4 or $5 to get your sprayer out and make this application. Others of you are hiring this application done. Maybe it's costing you $10, $12 to make this application. So as I show this ROI number, you need to take off what you think your application costs would be on top of that. So over 21 years, this has been a profitable practice to make a fungicide application, but it's just barely above breaking even in reality. So another thing I noticed as I look back in time, and as I listen to Matt talk about kind of the history of disease, a point that stood out to me was things have changed. We're in a totally different world with disease and management in 2026 than we were in 2010, right? So some of the things that Matt brought out was we're fighting totally different disease spectrum. Now we're facing a lot of tar spot and southern rust across our marketing area. So that's totally different. We've also got new and different genetics and hybrids that have different capacities in our bred to handle these diseases differently. And also we've got brand new products for fighting this, right? We've got new fungicide products that we didn't use 20 years ago. And so for those reasons, I've chosen for the rest of my presentation just to slice out the last 10 years of the data, because I think that's going to better capture the world that we're in today. So still over the last 10 years, we're still left with 470 replicated data points. So still a really strong data set here. And these numbers actually didn't change a lot. We're still looking at about 8.5 bushel fungicide response on average over the last 10 years. And our ROI has been $17 per acre. So overall, as we just look at this as a whole and a summary of this data, I think you could come to the conclusion of, fungicide has been a profitable practice for us. I'm just going to make that application every year. I don't think that's a bad battle plan to have, and just to have in your mind that over the long run, this has been a profitable practice to make this fungicide application. But I want to dive in a little deeper, and I think we can learn through this data what years and what situations we can maybe be more selective on when we make that application, and I think that can drive more profitability on our farm. Okay, so stepping into the data here, I'm going to start with just looking at a couple of different locations. I think this is going to illustrate a picture and a story that a lot of you are familiar with on your own farms, and kind of bring out some of the tensions behind this decision. So this is looking at a yield map or a yield graph of fungicide applications in central Illinois for the last 10 years. 2020, you'll see is missing data there. We didn't have any fungicide trials here in 2020. But you can see over the 9 years that remain there, fungicide has always been an agronomically sound decision. We've always gained yield with this fungicide pass. Some years better than others, right? And that's where some of the tension comes in. And then as I look at ROI here, so this is the same graph, but we're looking at ROI instead of yield. And this is where I think a lot of us feel the tension behind this fungicide application. Because you'll see 3 out of the 9 years represented here, we actually lost money when we factor in our costs associated with the pass. And a couple more of those years are just barely breaking even if we factor in our application costs, or maybe losing money on even more of those years. There's really only been a couple years in the last 10 years that we've made good money on this fungicide pass in central Illinois. Now looking at Iowa, and it's a similar story, right? But especially looking at the last 5 years, this is, I think, what we experience a lot of times in the farm. 4 out of 5 of the last 5 years, we've lost money essentially on this fungicide pass. But then 2025 comes around, and now we're making enough money to pay for those other years that we lost the money, right? It's kind of a common story that I hear told is fungicide is one of those applications we make as kind of an insurance policy. In some years, we're going to get a big payout that's going to pay for those other years. And again, I don't think that's a bad thought. But again, can we be more selective? And is there a way that we can know when we're in a year like 2025? And is there a way we can know when we're in years like 2021 to 2024? One of the challenges here is I'm going to flip the locations again. And remember here, 2025 was the big year in Iowa. If we look at Indiana, now it's totally opposite. Now in the last 5 years, 2025 was the only year we lost money, and the other years we gained money. So just, again, illustrating how from site to site, we see wild variability in our profitability here. And then the last side I want to show you is Kentucky, and this is going to transition me into the next topic I want to talk about. And I want to specifically look at these last 4 years. It's been kind of interesting in Kentucky. We've had almost identical yield responses on fungicide the last 4 years, from 6.4 to 6.9 bushels per acre. So really consistent yield response the last 4 years. But if I go to our ROI graph, you see a lot of variability there. And why is that? We had the same yield advantage, but we were in different economic situations. In 2022, we had a profitable year that year because corn was up at $6.11. Our Veltima cost was a little lower at a little under $23 per acre. And then we go to 2025, and now our corn prices come down quite a bit, and Veltima has gone up a little bit. So even though we've got the same yield response, one year we're making quite a bit of money, and one year we're just breaking even or maybe losing some money on this application. So that takes me to the next topic that I want to step back and talk about a little bit is economics. And I think it's good for us to understand some of the math, some of the economics behind this decision before we go into the decision-making season where we're deciding whether or not to make these applications. So stepping back to the basics, ROI, the way we calculate that, it's profit, it's income minus expense. And so for the fungicide application, our income there in green is our yield response times our corn price. For example, maybe we get a 10 bushel yield response. If our corn price is $4 per bushel, that's a $40 income. Our cost with the fungicide is the cost of the product. Then we've also got our application cost. So again, for some of you, that is whatever your custom applicator is charging you. For others, you need to know your fuel cost, your time, your equipment. All of those things go into this. So that's a really important thing to know and just be running those numbers in your head and to calculate your ROI. But I think a better formula would be knowing what your break-even yield is. And this is using the same variables, but you changing things around a little bit with some algebra, and we're able to calculate using our costs and our corn price, how much yield do we need from our fungicide application just to break even. So this is going to be wildly different from year to year, and I want to illustrate that with a couple of examples. So again, this is that same break-even yield formula. I would encourage you, as you're sitting there watching, if you want to pull out your calculator and be thinking through what you think your prices are on your farm, I would encourage you to do that right now and get a sense for what your break-even yield is. I'm going to step through a couple of examples to just illustrate why this is maybe important. And this first example is what I think is probably pretty close to accurate for a lot of us today for this year. And so this is the cost I'm putting in for this current prices calculation. Our fungicide cost, I used $24 per acre. I believe that was the Veltima cost that we used in the book for last year. Then I put in the application cost there, $10.50 per acre. That comes from Iowa State's custom rate survey as just the over-the-top self-propelled sprayer average charge. And then corn price there, I put $4.20. I think that factors in a little bit of a basis. That's probably pretty accurate for what some of you are facing today. So using those costs, already I know before I go into this fungicide season, I need 8.2 bushels to break even this year, if those are my costs. And so that puts me, if we think back to our overall yield response from fungicide, it was 8.5 bushels. We're getting pretty close to, we're just about at break even. Now, to illustrate why this is maybe important, I put together kind of a worst case scenario, and I'm going to show you a best case scenario. So these are maybe on the extreme ends of the spectrum, but I think these are situations that could still be possible. And so in this case, I've increased our fungicide cost up to $30 per acre, our application cost at $14.50, and our corn price down to $3.50. So I hope this isn't your situation, but this I think could be possible for some people in some years. And in this situation, now you need 12.7 bushels just to break even with the fungicide pass. Now let's compare that to a best case scenario that I hope you guys are at. Now we've got a fungicide cost down to $20 per acre, application cost $5, and then the corn price, I'm saying, what if we increase our corn price to $6.50? In this scenario, now we only need 3.8 bushels to break even. So you're getting a sense of, our economics play a big role into whether or not we should be maybe more aggressive with our fungicide and consider fungicide for more of our fields, or if we're in a situation more like this worst case scenario, I'm going to be pretty conservative on what fields and what situations I'm making these applications. Okay, this is a new graph showing the data set that I compiled. So this is showing all those data points from this 470 data points plotted out on what's called a sorted bar chart. And so this is showing the yield response of all 470 data points, ranked from lowest yield response all the way up to the highest yield response there on the right. And so you see at first glance, agronomically, almost all the time, these fungicide passes are giving us yield. It's a good agronomic decision. But I'm going to tie in those break-even yields into this graph and paint a little bit of a picture of why those matter. So this is showing, putting a line across there at 3.8 bushels, and that was our break-even yield in our best case scenario. So if you have really good prices, this is maybe where that break-even line would be. So all those applications, those bars on the right that are above that break-even yield line, those represent situations, those represent the plots in our past 10 years that we would have made an economic gain, that would have made money on these applications. And then on the left, where we're below that break-even yield line, that represents where we would have lost money. So it gives you a sense of, in that situation, we have a really good chance of making money on our fungicide application and a small chance of losing money. But now let's change that. Now that break-even yield line you see there has gone up to what our worst case scenario was at 12.7 bushels. And now we've got a really small sliver of data points in our past 10 years that would have made money at those economic rates, and a large portion of those data points that would have lost money. So again, this just gives you a sense of how aggressive we should be, how likely we are to see that economic gain. And then lastly, this is what I think is maybe fairly accurate for where a lot of us are today, our break-even yield of 8.2 bushels. And we're split kind of 50-50, slightly tipped towards more than likely going to lose money on these applications. So this begs the question, right? As we look at these graphs, how do we know when our field, what year and what field are we going to be on the right side, or we're going to get a large yield response? And how do we know when we're on the left side, when we're maybe going to lose money? And that's what I want to get into now with the rest of my presentation. And so as I talk through this data with some of my coworkers and agronomists and farmers, I tried to ask a lot of people, what are the things that you think drive the fungicide response? What things can we look at in the field that are going to indicate, do we get a large fungicide response or do we get a small fungicide response? And this is kind of a list of most of the things that people told me might play into that response. So we've got things like our location, our fungicide product we're using. We got some, our hybrids are going to play into whether we get a large response. Some of the things about our fields, our planting date, crop rotation, tillage type are going to matter. Our overall yield potential for that field. And then we've got disease pressure, what Matt talked about, and we've got some weather things that play in here. And so as we look at this list, I think this is a really good list of things that these are all going to play into our fungicide response. And it's going to be a combination of all of these things that play into this. But I'm going to talk about a couple of these that came out in the data that had really nice trends. And these four that are highlighted in green are the ones I'm going to show you. I just want to say, I'm not saying other things aren't good indicators, but these are four of the things that I thought the data really supported well and showed nice trends for. So I'm going to step through those now. I'm going to go back to disease pressure first. This is going to go back to what Matt was talking about. And this is definitely kind of obviously the biggest thing to look to, right, is when we're making a fungicide pass, are we seeing disease pressure? That's no secret. Obviously, our fungicide is targeting those diseases. But I'm going to talk about maybe some of the different diseases and how our data has indicated how strongly those disease pressure ratings are going to play into the response. Before I get into the data, I will mention we've really only got 2 years of data behind the graphs I'm going to show you, because in PFR, we've really only done a really good job of rating the disease in each of our plots for the last 2 years. And before that, we didn't have a standardized way of rating these. But I think the last 2 years have told a really good story nonetheless. So I'm going to show you gray leaf spot first. And again, this is those tannish gray lesions that are rectangular in shape that Matt talked about. And this is a disease for most of us, and most of this marketing area is going to show up every year. We're going to see it almost every year, like Matt said. there's not a huge variability in my experience. I don't see a lot of years where it shows up and becomes this really heavy pressure and really shuts the plant down. It's not a super aggressive disease compared to maybe tar spot or southern rust, but it's kind of one of those diseases that's always there. And like Matt said, it needs to be our plan A against disease, because it's just a disease we're going to fight every year. When we look at the graph here showing the last 2 years of data in PFR, I'm going to show you a bar graph showing the yield response to fungicide and the plots where we had no gray leaf spot, light, moderate, or heavy. So as you see the data, you see it's not wildly different. We don't see a huge difference in our yield response when we had light gray leaf spot versus when we had heavy gray leaf spot. And I think this goes back to this isn't a disease that comes in super aggressive and really shuts the plant down like some of our other diseases do. It's a disease that's probably going to be there most years, but it's not a strong indicator of, wow, I'm seeing gray leaf spot, I really need to get out there and spray. Now I'm going to contrast that to southern rust. And again, like Matt said, this is a disease that doesn't show up every year. It shouldn't really be our plan every year that we're going to see southern rust. But it can be wildly different from year to year. That's been the case in the last 2 years. In 2024, we didn't see a lot of southern rust across a lot of our footprint. 2025, in contrast, we had to come in pretty heavy in a lot of our locations. And so I think this data really shows that. Where we had light southern rust compared to where we had heavy southern rust, a large difference there. And you can see 17.2 bushels is a phenomenal yield response from fungicide. And so I'm going to say, if you see southern rust showing up moderate to heavy in your field, this is a strong indicator that we need to be going out and making that application and considering, beefing that application up, maybe making 2 passes or maybe shifting later in the year, maybe shifting our game plan a little bit if we see this disease. Okay, switching gears to rainfall now. I'm going to talk about rainfall and humidity. I'm going to start with rainfall. And so for these graphs, you're going to see, this is going to be a scatter chart. So you're going to see all the data points in this set are going to be scattered on this graph. On the x-axis on the bottom there, you see the numbers there are the amount of rain we had in June in inches. And then on the y-axis going up is the yield response. So first off, you're going to see there's data points kind of all over the place here. It's a scatter chart. The data can be kind of everywhere, and you see the trend line going up and to the right. And so you'll notice right off the bat that the trend does go up, but there's years where we had a lot of rain in June and we still had a poor fungicide response. There's years where we didn't have a lot of rain in June and still had an excellent fungicide response. So this goes back to, there's a lot of things that go into the fungicide response. What we're looking for is overall trends. And this actually overall is a pretty good trend here in June. As we get more rain in June, we do see that data tend to go up and we see more fungicide response. I'm going to contrast that to July here. And you see that trend line starts to flatten out a little bit, but it's still there. And then lastly, as we go to August, we again see that trend. It's still kind of there, but it's definitely flattening out. And so this is kind of was kind of counterintuitive to me. I would have thought, from my experience walking fields, it's really late July and August that we see the disease go from just a few lesions to really exploding and causing a lot of problems in the field. So I would have intuitively thought these are the months that matter. And if we get a lot of rain in these months, it's going to drive the disease. But the data has shown it's really June and July that set us up for that disease to flourish. So this is showing June and July rainfall together. And I think this paints a really nice picture. That trend is definitely showing us we get more rain through those months, we're a lot more likely to see a fungicide response. And what I love about this is we can get a really strong sense of where we're at before we make these applications using this data. So this is going back to the June graph. And on the right there, I've placed a map showing from this year the amount of rain we've gotten, across the Midwest. So you can find yourself on that map. For where I'm at, we're already sitting at 5 or 6 inches. Actually, since this map has, in the last 2 days, we've gotten another couple inches. So we're sitting at 7 inches for this site of rain for June already. So as you look at the data again on the left, if you put yourself at 7 inches of rain, we're definitely up there, and we're setting ourselves up for a higher fungicide response. Just thinking about the rainfall from this year. Okay, now switching gears to humidity, and this is going to be really related, so I'm going to kind of buzz through this pretty quick. Obviously, if we get a lot of rainfall, we're also setting ourselves up for a lot of humidity. So you're going to see a lot of similarities in the graphs here. I'm going to show you June first, and you actually see June being pretty flat here. As we get more humid, we don't see a huge response in fungicide. We compare that to July, where we start to get a really nice trend there in July. So I really think July is the month that's going to matter here the most. We go to August and the trend is still there, but it's definitely flattened out some. And then lastly, if we look at June and July together, we again see that nice trend there. So in review, as we're thinking about our weather patterns, I think a really good thing to think about is June. How much rain did we have in June and early July? And then how much humidity have we gotten in July are going to be strong drivers of that disease. Okay, last topic I'm going to talk about is yield potential. And what I mean by yield potential is thinking about our field and are we set up in that field to have a really strong yield, or are there limitations in the field that are going to keep our potential down in the field? And how does that play in with if we should make that fungicide application or not? So as I looked at this data overall, I had all the locations for all our PFR locations together on one graph. It didn't really tell much of a story. It was kind of scattered. But as I looked through individual locations, a story started to emerge. And so I separate out here. I've got Central Illinois and Iowa first here. And these are sites that are highly productive soils. We've got really good fertility. We've got tile drainage, high organic matter. These are highly productive farms. And you'll see that in the data here. Our data range goes from 200 bushels on the very low end all the way up to basically 300 bushels on the right. So you can tell these are highly productive farms. And you see a trend as we were in yield situations where we had higher yield potential there on the right, we do see a larger fungicide response compared to when it was a lower yield potential. Now, when I contrast that with Indiana and Ohio, and these are sites, now you can see the yield potential goes from 150 up to 275. And so, these soils are a little less forgiving. We can get too much rain, we can get not enough rain in these sites, and it can really limit our yield. And so you see there, especially in these sites, if we have some yield limiting factor that's keeping us below 200 bushels, our likelihood of getting a strong response to fungicide has diminished greatly. And so as you think about your fields, I think your prairie soils, your nice fields that are really consistent for you, those are probably going to have pretty consistent fungicide responses. If you have some fields that are maybe a little more marginal, poor drainage, maybe you get deer feeding, some factor that comes in and limits your yield from year to year, you should maybe be more selective on those fields and think about, is this a good yield year in that field, or is this a poor yield year in that field, and maybe be more selective. Okay, that takes me through all the data that I had to share with you today. I'm just going to kind of wrap it up with suggesting that these are the three things that I would look at based on the data that I think we should be thinking about as we go into this fungicide decision season, if we should make these applications or not. And the first one is always going to be your disease pressure, right? So get out and scout. That's a great way of knowing how likely we are to get that response. Number two is economics. I think this is a great way of running the numbers. I think we know some of our economics, and we can know how aggressive or how conservative we should be with our fungicide applications. And lastly, rainfall and humidity. And again, it's June seems to be the month that matters for rainfall, and July seems to be the month that matters for humidity. So I appreciate you bearing with me here, and sorry for those technical difficulties. And I'm wrapped up here. So Colin, I will hand this over to you and to Clayton.
Excellent job, Andrew. I really think it's cool, all the data that you've done, and just start looking at, June rains, July rains, and how that really affects fungicide response moving forward. And, when you start thinking about the rain events we've had here in the last 2 weeks with the tornadoes and all the severe weather, I just kind of wonder what kind of fungicide response are we going to see here this coming fall. So lastly here, our last presenter today is going to be Clayton Stuffelbeam. And so we, as Beck's PFR roles, we have 9 Beck-owned locations, 3 cooperative sites, but then we also do on-farm trials. There's a lot of trials that it's just hard to do in our small plot research or our research farms there at our locations. And so we need to get into a bigger field. And so Clayton Stuffelbeam, he is our PFR agronomist, and he does all things PFR on farm, anything from planter trials to fungicide trials with drones and aerial. And so today he's really going to dive into some of our 2025 PFR on farm data. What's the best application method for fungicide, whether that's aerial, whether that's a ground rig, whether that's a drone, and what are the important factors to a successful fungicide application? So Clayton, the floor is yours, my man.
Thanks, Colin, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Like Colin said, I take care of the bulk majority of the on-farm trials. Think about trials on your farm, your fields, big scale trials, and then replicated just like we would do at a research site. So that's kind of what I do on a daily basis. I'm going to step into what we learned in 2025 first, and then we'll roll into our plan, my plan for 2026. So in 2025, this was the last year for a 3 to 4 year trial on ground versus airplane versus drone fungicide data. When we started these trials, our goal wasn't necessarily to pin each other against each other, but was to determine, we've seen the success in the ground machine in our research trials at the research locations, but did an airplane, a drone, a helicopter have the same or similar efficacy as that ground machine? So we really wanted to learn that. It is important to note in these trials that they were all applied with the same water at the same time of day. So usually the ground machine or the airplane would go first, and then I'd bring up the backside with the drone and finish the application at the same time of day, same water, everything treated the same way. Our control of no fungicide across these locations was 236 bushel per acre. It is also important to note that our disease levels were much higher in 2025 than they were in previous years. So we look at the ground machine first, we had a gain of 11.4 bushels, and that paid pretty well at a return on investment of $24.61 an acre. The airplane gave us almost 10 bushel an acre gain and a $17 return on investment. And then the drone gave us 12 bushels per acre gain with a $27 return on investment. It's important to note that the operator matters, and we'll dive deeper into that as we get into it. Also, it's also important to note that all three applications were profitable. If you had an application charge to each of these, they all made money and they all did work. When we look at the 3-year multi-location, so bring in 23, 4, 5 together and average those seasons out. Ground machine applications were made at 15 to 20 gallon per acre, depending on the year and the operation. The airplane and the drone both ran 2 gallon per acre rates. The ground machine return on investment was 844. The airplane was 313, and the drone was 1317. So the drone just kind of rising to the top there. Like I said, again, the operator matters. Time of day of application matters. And boiling to the top was the drone. Let's dig into helicopter data. It's really awesome to see this data set here. Different locations, same trial protocol. A little bit less disease severity in the helicopter trials in 2025. But if you look at the data, everything can be considered equal. Statistically, no differences right there. Everything worked very well. However, if you were to add an application charge in these locations, I think there was 4 or 5 locations for this trial. If you were to add an app charge to that, it would have been break even or below. So largely did not pay last year for these specific locations. And the yield levels were higher for the helicopter trials for whatever reason. When we look at the multi-year data, ground machine did very well, $14 an acre, and the drone also did very well, $16 an acre. The helicopter a little bit further behind, kind of like the airplane. However, if you were to pull apart the data set from the airplane and the helicopter trials, There are fields where the airplane was well and above the other two treatments, and the same goes with helicopters. Just for whatever reason, there was a few locations that the airplane or helicopter data was a little bit lower. Now let's go into a location last year that was planned to be an airplane, drone, and ground machine trial. However, the day we sprayed at the airstrip where the airplane was stationed, it rained enough on the grass airstrip that the airplane could not fly out. So we pivoted and continued on with just a control, ground, and drone trial. I wish we could have sprayed the airplane in this trial because by far after application, disease really set in, and it was my highest disease severity trial in 2025. Matt talked earlier about the money portion of the plant to protect, and we see that in these three pictures. The control, you can tell, is riddled with southern rust and a little bit of tar spot. The ground machine was pretty well protected from the top clear down to the bottom. If you look at the picture, the bottom portion of the plant, you can tell, was still protected pretty well. With the drone, ear leaf and above was protected, your money-making portion of the plant. But the lower portion, you can tell we did not get that application deep into the canopy. The lower leaves have broken off from the stalk and are riddled with disease. How did this turn out? I flew my camera drone over the field on September 5th of 2025, and you can tell where the ground machine was, the untreated controls, and the drone. You can also tell on the far left control, the drone right to the right of that, we ran out, and the software in the drone didn't tell me we ran out, and it sprayed or flew the remainder of the pass. And you can tell exactly where that drone ran out. You can also tell the drone, as far as plant health, was probably a little bit behind the ground machine and might have streaked a little bit. If you look at the yield map harvested on October 8th, it matches very well to the plant health drone flown map. And it's one of the first times in my career, I've been doing this for 15 years, one of the first times in my career where you can really see the yield map line up with the trial and you know what was what. When we look at the data from that trial, no fungicide being my control, the ground machine at 10 gallons per acre gave us 31 bushels per acre gain at a return on investment of $109 an acre. So a huge response in a very high disease severity field, and it gave us, it paid off very well. The drone gave us 28 bushels per acre. So a little bit behind that ground machine, but still returned $96 an acre. So was that drone application a failure in very high disease? In my opinion, it was not. It still performed, maybe a little bit behind the ground machine. I'm going to tell you, this ground machine applicator, he did a good job, never ran over any corn. He sprayed slow. The best job any ground applicator could do. We did have a little bit of crosswind with that drone that day, and I think that's part of the reason why our yields weren't quite as high. Also, because we didn't drive that fungicide solution deep into the canopy was another reason why we were off the tick a little bit. However, it was still successful. This is on my farm in West Central Illinois, and this is a fungicide trial. I flew it with my drone on September 3rd of 25, and you can tell exactly where we sprayed. We did not spray the inrows in the field. We only sprayed the trial portion. And I thought, wow, this is going to be interesting as the season progresses. I came back a couple of weeks later on the 22nd of September, and from this drone image, I thought we probably ought to walk in the field. You could tell where the untreated controls are, and you can tell maybe some tops are breaking out of plants. So this really pushed me forward to do some push tests, and I want you to keep this tool in your toolbox this season as we get closer to harvest. Walk into the field and put your feet at the base of the plant and just slowly extend your arm. And if you push plants over, you might have to make a game day decision on your harvest plan. So I put some numbers to this. In the upper right portion of your screen, you can tell untreated and fungicide. So I just did push tests in those treatments. In the fungicide, in the untreated, sorry, these were in 3 separate locations. I pushed on 400 plants. Of those 400, I pushed over 243. So that was a 61% pushover rate. In the fungicide treatments, I pushed over 81 of the 400. So a 40% decrease in the amount of plants that I pushed over. This is what's important to note here. You would think by looking at the September 3rd picture, that fungicide would have paid. And it broke even only. It did not pay. By the time I put an application charge in, we would have been in the red. However, if I would not have scouted this, and we would have continued on with our farm plan of cutting soybeans, I believe this corn would have been down, and the fungicide would have paid tremendously. These are the unseen costs of not spraying a fungicide. How do you know when the corn is getting ready to give up the ghost? I learned this from Matt Montgomery last season, is to look at your crown roots, like at the picture in the left side of the screen. If you see sunken lines in those crown roots, that means it's starting to pull the nutrients out of the roots themselves, and it's pulling the nutrients out of the stalk. And it's going to start cannibalizing itself, allowing that plant to fall over. It's pulling the nutrients out of those portions of the plant to continue to feed the ear. So I do recommend every season to scout your fields. If you've got a camera drone, it's a great time to use it, and you can tell where the tops are starting to go down out of that picture on the right. Now changing the topic a little bit to talk about pH and fungicide interactions. First thing we'll cover is half-life. So solution half-life by pH. What does that mean? And this is sourced from Purdue. Usually that source is on this slide. For whatever reason, it's not here today, but it is sourced from Purdue. Half-life means when I mix my solution and when the half-life has elapsed, what percent of that solution is still good? So, for example, pH of 9 with a fungicide. So the moment we mix that solution at pH of 9, the half-life is 2 minutes. So that means after 2 minutes has elapsed, 50% of my solution basically isn't good anymore. It starts hydrolysis the moment we mix, and it's constantly going through that. A pH of 7, so lowering that pH, brings the half-life up to 3 hours. So I can mix, load, and spray in 3 hours and do the job. A pH of 5 is 10 hours. So better yet, that's kind of my opinion. That's my target pH when I'm spraying a fungicide. Herbicides and insecticides also have half-lives, but they're much different than fungicides. Looking at water source is also important. So I did a simple study with 2 mason jar samples of water, Effingham PFR being one sample and a sample from a Western Illinois well. You can tell the starting pH of the Western Illinois well was less than the starting pH of the Effingham PFR site. And I used Brandt Indicate 5 to buffer that solution of water, and I wanted to know how much solution of Indicate 5 it would take to move that pH in a sub 5 category. So the Effingham water took 0.25 milliliters. For the Western Illinois well, it took 2 milliliters, so a lot more to get that into a sub 5 pH category. If we do the math on this and we calculate out this to 1,000-gallon load, it'd take 45 ounces for the Effingham water and then take 360 ounces or 2.8 gallons for the Western Illinois well. The Western Illinois well had a much higher buffering capacity, which means it takes more solution to swing that water one direction or the other. It also had a lot more total diluted solids. So there was more solids there, and it took more solution to swing that pH value. Just think about your water. My challenge for you is to test your water this season and know where you stand. And then adjust that water properly. If we take that Western Illinois well water sample and we do a trial on their farm, what happens when we adjust our pH? So fungicide alone versus an untreated control. Our starting water pH was 7.6, just like the previous slide. It's the same water. We gained $20.82 by spraying fungicide alone. When I use Full Tech adjuvant from Spray Tech, we lowered the pH drastically down to 3.4. That was a $40 return. So we doubled our ROI just based off of adding a adjuvant that could change the pH down. Now, Brant, indicate 5. We got the pH down to 5.1. And then we tripled our ROI over the fungicide alone. It's a $63 return on investment for that fungicide. That's making your fungicide application much more successful by adding an adjuvant like Brant Indicate 5 or Full Tech adjuvant. Here's the caveat. We've got to be careful with adjuvants. A lot of adjuvants have a non-ionic surfactant base like Brant Indicate 5. So as the tassels are coming out and the silks are emerging, we want to make sure we're not spraying fungicides with an NIS at that time. The tassel needs to be all the way out and the silks need to be all the way out. If they're not fully emerged, we can burn silk and abort kernels on the ear. We want to make sure we're careful with this. If we get past those critical growth stages, you've got a green light to go ahead and use these products. We do want to talk a little bit about timing, knowing if we've got disease pressure or knowing that you're going to spray a fungicide this season, what timing should we utilize? So a 2-pass system, we're seeing V10 and R1 as the best timing, as a $20.82 return at V10, followed by Veltima at R1. Pretty good returns right there. Now, if we're going to target a single pass application, and that's our plan, R1 is our target because that has proved to be the best time for an ROI, best ROI advantage. So R1, $22 an acre. If we get into R2, which would be blister, we have very less ROI advantage, and that continues on as we get later on in the season. I do want to note, though, if we've got southern rust starting to come in, it's probably best to focus on a brown silk time frame versus R1 because the disease continues to progress throughout the season, and we want to fight it as it progresses. Lastly, application performance varies. If you can spot the issue in this slide, it is the plane in the upper left. He's flying high, and I watched him fly, and he flew high the whole field. In the upper right, that plane is right into the canopy right there, doing a good job. And the helicopter also was doing a good job in this application. It's important to note that in an airplane or a helicopter, it's life and death. Those guys have very long days, and these things can happen. The pilot in the upper left might have had a very good day the previous day. For whatever reason, he was having a bad day this day, and he flew pretty high. And think about your application. How, in the dollar spent, what was my ROI in these factors? A ground machine can also do a bad job. You can run over corn and then really take your return on investment down. Drones can also do a bad job. Unfortunately, this is one of my trials. The drone did streak. In this particular trial, it's the only one that I found that I streaked. You can see my controls on the far left, a couple passes over, a control again, and then on the right side of the screen, there's my third and then fourth control. In between each of those, you can see the streaks. Same hybrid across the field. We streaked, but we still gained yield. And I think that's important to remember that this maybe the center 8 rows of a 12-row head still had good fungicide coverage, and we still had good return on investment. It was like $25 an acre here. But if we get a wind event following this, what's it going to do to my untreated acres? How do we prevent streaking with aerial applications? So last 2 years, I attended pattern testing events, and I've learned a lot. And I attended another one on Monday of this week, and they were struggling with airplanes. So they're still learning that process. These guys have been doing it for 30 years. Things are still getting better with aerial applications. What about drones? So the crew that I worked with from University of Illinois Extension last year had only tested 2 drones, mine and another one. Since then, they tested mine again this year and then another one. So they've tested 4 drones. Across the marketplace, that doesn't give me much confidence that many drones are being tested scientifically. How else can you do this? You can actually do this on your own farm or your own operation. If you've got a drone, drop flight is a good way to do it. I have a drop flight pattern test kit, and you can see the kit on the lower 2 pictures right there. Basically what we do is we use water sensitive paper, 2 feet increments across a 60 to 70 foot line. And then we scan those water sensitive cards after we fly the drone over with our phones. And that will give us a lot of different important aspects of that application that we can change on every flight path. So my goals with this would be achieve the droplet size range that is required from the label, determine swath width and speed of application. We want to try to achieve efficiency and, most importantly, reliability and repeatability. So some pattern testing vocabulary. The 2 most important things are coverage and VMD. So coverage is a percentage of the card's surface covered by droplets as we scan those droplets with our phones. VMD is volume medium diameter. The midpoint droplet size where half of the total spray volume consists of smaller droplets and half consists of larger droplets. That is measured in microns. If you look at a label, the droplet size requirement on the label is in VMD. What does a fungicide label say for aerial application? Altitude. Altitude cannot be greater than 10 feet above the crop canopy unless for pilot safety. That is for Moravis Neo fungicide. Wind has a ceiling maximum of 10 miles an hour. Droplet size, most labels recommend medium to coarse droplets. Moravis Neo states use the largest droplets possible to provide target pest control. So medium to coarse droplets, we're looking at 236 to 404 microns. Let's make a note about this wind real quick. On pattern test day on Monday, the testing professionals were telling us that wind is actually important to have some, because we had very little wind Monday and our patterns were struggling with the airplanes and the drone. So wind can be your friend. Too much wind can be devastating. A crosswind will take that pattern and move it completely sideways in the direction of the wind. which I'll show you right here. This is a very busy graph. I'm going to try to walk you through it. So we're going to look at passes. The red line with the drone on top, that is where the drone flew each of these 3 passes. That would be pass 1 is green. That would be center of drone. If you've seen pass 1, you think, hey, we're right where we need to be. Pass 2 is purple. Can you tell which way my wind was blowing? It was blowing from left to right on your screen. We moved the center of that pattern over about 7 feet. Pass 3, we moved it the other direction. If we look at the red bars or the red rectangles on the right side of the graph, we can see my VMD was 306 microns in the lower part of the range, but my estimated swath width was 50 feet. I would love to spray 50 feet swath width because that gives me the efficiency I'm desiring to get acres done. So what can we do to tighten up that pattern? If you can see in the upper right, my atomizers were set on 24%. These were my 2025 settings. I've got a different drone, same model, that I had last year. Every drone is going to be different, even if they're the same model. So I took the atomizer. The atomizer is the picture in the upper left, and I slowed it down for my next set of flights. So when I slow the atomizers down, it produces larger droplets. It's not going to throw them as far, and it's going to shear those droplets slower. So let's do that. Let's take my atomizers from 24% and slow them down to 20%. That scale is 0 to 100%. Flew the drone down the same path, and you can tell we tightened up quite a bit. Our VMD was 369, and my swath width, we moved it down to 23 feet. So unfortunately, my efficiency also went down with the swath width. But we did tighten up. The wind still did push pass 1 to the left and pass 2 and 3 to the right off of center. Let's slow them down 1 more percentage point to 19%. Much better. We tightened up again. My swath width was actually a little bit wider here, which is kind of hard to understand, but my VMD was much bigger. Let's tighten up 1 more time. Let's go down to 18%. Microns are really big at 422. Swath width landed at 27%. That's where we're going to spray going forward, at least I thought, until we tested Monday. So these are drop flight pattern tests right here, not the professionals. This is me doing the testing. Let's see what that looks like with the coverage cards. So the yellow card is center position of where that drone flew, and the white cards below is what it looks like when we scan. You can tell which way my wind was blowing on this single pass, 7.4 miles per hour angled headwind, drone flying into the headwind and the wind coming at an angle towards the drone from the right to the left. Very good microns size-wise, but you can tell which way we were pushing that pattern. Now let's talk about the professionals. Same settings, 18% atomizers, 10-foot altitude, 30 miles an hour. Very tight pattern. They were very happy with it, but my microns read differently with the professionals than it did with drop flight. And that's just because they're using a scanning device that's very sensitive and they're capturing the fines that drop flight cannot capture alone. So my recommendation is, if you're a drone operator, is to pattern test your drone with drop flight if you can. Get your bounds of where you kind of want to do it with a professional, and that will make that day go much better. We only had enough time to do 9 passes on Monday with the professionals, and I've flown over 40 passes with drop flight. My composite score, here's what it looks like. We bring those together and you can see the square in the bottom blue graph. That's my swath width. We landed on 25 feet. That's basically the same as what drop flight told me. And then my CV ratings, my coefficient of variance was low at 25 feet. So that means it is a very repeatable pattern. What about testing 2 drones on the same settings? So Eagle 1 is a drone that is stationed in El Paso, and Dorothy is my drone. If we fly them on the same exact settings, the VMD for Eagle 1 was 380, and the VMD for Dorothy was 462 based off of those 3 flights for each drone. A VMD of 462 has 77% more volume per droplet than a VMD of 380. So think about that. If you're running 2 machines, I do recommend pattern testing those machines. If you get a new drone every couple of years, I do recommend pattern testing those, because streaking of fields only going to get you so far and you'll lose business over time. So we got to walk the line of efficiency and doing a good job and controlling disease. Lastly, increasing your fungicide success as a whole. There's a lot that we could have talked about today, but simply due to time, we couldn't. I recommend scanning this QR code. It'll take you to our profitable spray pass document that has many different aspects when it comes to the profitable spray pass. Nozzles, time of day, a lot of other things that are very important with herbicides and fungicide applications. That brings me to CEU tracking for you CCA members out there. If you would like to receive credit for this webinar, scan that QR code and follow the directions on this screen, and it will walk you through that. So with that, let's bring up Matt and Andrew, and Colin can lead us through questions.
Yeah, excellent job by all 3 of you guys. We do have a handful of questions on the text line and also in the chat box. And so the first question we will get going here is from the text thread. First one being generic versus brand name fungicide. Is either one better than the other when it comes to that?
Yeah, I think the comment I would make on fungicide is, I think we've talked through here just a little bit about just how important that investment is for yield or for standability. I'm not really wound up whether it's a brand name or generic, but what I am wound up about is I want 2 modes of action in there, because in particular, there's a group of fungicides called the strobies, and if we apply that single mode of action product, we're going to really run ourselves the chance of wrecking that tool. It's very resistance prone. So I think really important, if you use a generic, make sure it's a 2 active ingredient, 2 different mode of action in particular product to make sure we're good stewards of that tool.
Got one here. If I was thinking about adding something to my fungicide pass, say a micronutrient or something like that, what would be the micronutrient of choice? And if I was going to do that, could I add too much?
Boron's mine.
Yeah, boron is what comes, I think, to all 3 of our minds. And yeah, I think boron's a good selection. I think they also tapped into a key point on that is that we can run into boron toxicity. So use one product. There's a list of those products actually in the PFR guide that we've worked with. Pick one of those, run with that. Don't do what I do with trying to rehabilitate myself when I get hurt, where I push it too far. I decide I'm going to double up on the exercises and I screw myself over. Pick one of those boron products and run with it rather than deciding more is better. Use one, hold it to that.
Why is boron critical at an R1 growth stage?
Yeah, it becomes super important in that reproductive period. Plays a lot into that reproductive period.
Excellent. One more here on the text line. This is probably for Matt here. Is there any management that I can do to help eliminate overwintering of those foliar diseases?
Yeah. So, I mean, I suppose we talked about ways to tame down residue, and we've talked in PFR about some of the value of materials that help break down residue. That probably helps. We probably also, though, live in a world where there's a ton of residue, and our ability really to eliminate enough residue to tame down our risk is probably slight. So I think there's reasons to look at residue reducing products. I wouldn't count on those being the primary way that we're going to cut down our foliar disease risk, because there's just a lot of residue in the countryside and overwintering material in the countryside anymore.
Would you agree it's safe to say more tillage? The more tillage you do, the more you're going to reduce some of that residue.
Right.
risk.
You're going to tame down your risk, recognize we're not going to eliminate that risk. And it's one component probably of a larger battle. Don't count on that single practice that reduces residue being the kind of end all for getting foliar disease under control.
That leads me into how much disease can come from neighboring fields that aren't yours if you're really trying to control your residue, but the neighbor's on a total different program than yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of what we were talking about. There's a little bit of spore movement around that makes it hard for us to really slash dramatically reductions in yield. It does help, but recognize there is kind of a flush of spores floating around in the countryside that probably increase the risk for all of us. There are benefits, though. If I was going to triage fields, one of the things I might look at is the relative amount of residue in a certain field. And if it's pretty heavy in residue, that probably shifts up on the list. Lower on residue, maybe it pulls that back a little bit with some other factors considered as well.
One more here off the chat or the comment section here. Can you touch on the compound issues with Fusarium stalk rot and foliar infections, and how to work with the season that is conducive to stalk and crown rot?
Yeah, I don't know. You guys want me to jump in here?
I think that one's yours.
Okay, I'll jump in here on that one. So, with a lot of the crown rot issues that we talked about, remember that initial conversation we had about we want a good foundation, and that foundation oftentimes is hybrid selection. So if we feel like we're in a crown rot type scenario where we've run into that an awful lot, I think starting out with a good hybrid is really important. That's one of the conversations you have to have with the person that sells you seed. But then on top of that, think back to what Clayton talked about. He gave that example of the home farm, and he said, yield-wise, it didn't look like that fungicide application was going to do a lot yield-wise, but there was a huge cannibalization difference. And anytime we can maintain the plant's health, maintain that upper portion of the canopy, keep it greener a little bit longer, we tame down the chances of crown rot and stalk rot coming in. An unhealthy plant, a plant that's struggling, allows those two issues to come in. So think about that hybrid selection, and then also think about that fungicide application playing in there to maintain plant health, maintain that crown, lower stalk health, and tame down some of those issues.
One from Justin Skinner. So, and this one really hits home, especially last night, dealing with the storms. A lot of hail damage in central Illinois last night. What data do we have on hail damaged plants? And is there more or less of a benefit to getting a fungicide on those acres?
Basically, if you have a target plan to already spray fungicide, our data would suggest you carry on with that plan. The return on investment is a little bit lower for a fungicide with hail versus compared to no hail. However, the return on investment is still there. It's just minutely less. We're talking $21 an acre for fungicide versus no hail, and then $18.50 an acre for fungicide when hail was present. So, and we have ways to make hail happen in our trials. You're muted, Colin.
Yep, sorry, my mistake. One more here on the comment section here. Have you ever done a study with fungicide insecticide, and foliar nutrition, and with the synergistic effect and doing them all together?
So we don't have a trial in memory of doing everything together. Now, we've done additive trials with an additive alone and fungicide. We've also done trials with insecticide and without insecticide with the fungicide. My stance is there's synergism with fungicide and insecticide. I like it from that standpoint. We don't like it from an IPM standpoint. Matt, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think there is some kind of synergism that happens there. There probably are some reasons for us to be conscious of not constantly rolling those two together. Maybe part of the thought is if you're going to do that, figure out a percentage of your acres you're going to do that. I'd hate to see us just blanket do that on everything, because it is not the best stewardship and best public display when we go down that road. So just be a little cautious on that point.
As far as those additives go and micros, if you look in the front section of the PFR book and the PFR proven section, there's plenty of things that we've tested over time, and a lot of those do in fact add to return on investment.
One additional thing I'm thinking of, and it doesn't really usually play out this way with the addition of insecticide, but I have seen some cases where we got ambitious maybe, and this has played out. Anytime we do that, that we apply material, maybe minus need, we do occasionally run into the possibilities of pest resurgence where we knock out the good guys, because there are good guys in that field, and we can knock those out and can kind of take those players off the field and then let some other things suddenly spike because there's nothing to hold them in check. That's another reason why, yes, there's a synergistic effect, but maybe let's be a little cautious about how many acres we're doing that on. And in the environment we're in, Andrew, you talked about return on investment in your presentation. That's another thing to keep in mind as well, is that when we're adding in those products, we're increasing costs. That's decreasing return. That's making that ROI a little bit tighter.
One more question here off the text thread. So this is for you, Clayton. There's a PFR proven study on fungicide that says ground rigs optimal gallons per acre is 15 to 20 over 10 gallons. However, we're seeing drones outperform at 2 gallons per acre. Why is that contradictory over water volume or on water volume?
It's a twofold question. One of them is kind of hard to put in words. I'll do the easy one first. My opinion, an airplane, helicopter, drone, when you take a 2 gallon per acre rate and compare it to a 10, 15, 20 gallon per acre rate, the same, if you have acres that are the same for ground versus aerial in your mix, the amount of fungicide or product you're going to spray is the same, but your percentage of active ingredient in an individual droplet is, if you compare 20 gallon per acre load versus a 2 gallon per acre load, active ingredient in a droplet is 10x. Okay. And I think that's where the effectiveness of an aerial application beats the ground machine. The other portion of that, depending on what fungicide you're spraying, going back to that pH talk, when you have that much less water and you have that much more fungicide in a tank, the fungicide, if it is below pH neutral, can swing a given water sample more than a ground application just because you have less water. That really depends on the water sample. If you take that Effingham, Illinois versus that Western Illinois well, it's probably not going to make much difference because the Western Illinois well is, the water sample is so hard to move. But in Effingham's case, it might make the difference, and that might be the difference paired with the active ingredient percentage in the droplet.
Yeah.
I got 2 more questions here. Would Xyway LFR at planting be beneficial to crown rot?
Yeah, I think you guys have done more of the work with Xyway than.
I'll let Andrew talk about the PFR site trials, and I'll give a little bit of on-farm perspective to that.
Yeah, and the PFR trials I've done with Xyway, we've kind of done different combinations of just Xyway alone at a lower rate and then a higher rate, and we've combined that with the foliar application later in the season. And our research has shown that the best treatment we've done has been Xyway plus an R1 foliar treatment. That's just looking strictly at ROI and yield, right? The efficacy on the crown rot, I think it's safe to say it's got efficacy there. It's showing up in the yield, but the difference there hasn't been huge. The difference between Xyway plus R1 compared to just the R1 fungicide is not a huge difference.
Now, we did do a few Xyway trials on farm a couple years ago, not very many. Xyway wasn't applied the same way we applied at the PFR site. So one location was applied with a strip freshener, a 2x2, and then the other was applied through a huck step shoe in furrow. It's important to remember with Xyway that the solution cannot touch the seed, so a huck step shoe kind of puts it off to the side a little bit. Both of those applications were not profitable. So with anything, my recommendation always is try it before you buy it. So try a little bit if you've got the ability to apply Xyway 2x2x2 on your corn planter. Try a portion in the field, figure out a way to run the data. Every year, it's getting easier for you as an operation to be able to access and analyze your yield data and your planting data, and then make decisions based off of those on your own operation.
Maybe a way to, when people are trying to figure out a prioritized list. We talked about the hybrid, protecting that upper part of the plant. You talked about that R1 application looking a little bit better. Those are two critical plays. And then if you feel like it's an affordable thing, you could potentially also look at that Xyway application. But I think two critical plays, the hybrid and also thinking about that R1 application to increase health of the plant deeper into the season to ward off some of that propensity to get crown rot or lower stalk rot.
Now, you found the data while we've been talking here, Andrew. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the numbers that surfaced up.
So I the big things to look at here, you're not going to be able to see it, but if you had a PFR book in front of you, you'd see we did 10.5 ounces Xyway 2x2x2, and we combined that with an R1 Veltima application. We compared that to just that R1 Veltima application. Then we looked at the higher rate 15.2 ounces Xyway alone, and then with the R1 application. And looking at that data overall, when we compare just the Xyway versus the Veltima, if we're just looking at doing one or the other on those, the Veltima alone had a $44 ROI. The Xyway alone had a $28 ROI. So if you're looking at one or the other, based on our data, we would say keep the R1 and don't do the Xyway. Now, the best treatment out of all those was actually the Xyway plus the Veltima, but it's only $1 better than the Veltima alone.
That's page 41 in the book, and I think it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning. If we can, maintaining entire plant health matters. The whole plant matters. But if we have to be picky, upper part of the plant, really important to protect when it comes to yield and standability.
Got another one here. We have received about 12 inches of rain over the past 2 weeks in northeastern Illinois. A lot of our acres do not have a planned fungicide. Should we shift to applying fungicides?
I'd say, yeah, as you look at that data, you're definitely setting yourself up. You're setting yourself up to be, you're wet, you're probably going to be humid, right? So the data, the trend is going to say you're setting yourself up for more of a response. You need to think about everything else too. If your corn price is lower this year and your cost is up, you need to think about that. You need to think about, you still need to scout and know what you're facing. But looking at the rainfall alone, I would say, yes, that's probably an indication. You should be a little more aggressive with your fungicide, maybe consider that a little stronger this year. Would you guys agree?
Yeah.
I remember 2021 in my home area. We had a June very similar to this. We've got over 5 inches in the past 2 weeks. And 21 for me was a very heavy tar spot year, corn going down. I think it's starting to shape up like that. And I'm a big proponent of scouting, so I'm going to keep in touch. And I come from a farm that we don't spray fungicide every year. We kind of pick our acres and go from there. And This year we might spray more than normal.
And then this last question here, I don't know if you guys can pull up Andrew's yield response bar chart to talk through that. But his question is on that yield response bar chart is, why does fungicide cause yield loss in the bottom 10% of studies?
Yeah, I think this is the chart you're referring to here.
Yep.
This is showing all the response. So yeah, you can see on the far left there's actually some applications that we show a yield, a drag to the fungicide, you might say. Now, I'm gonna say it. These guys can correct me if they think I'm wrong here, but I would probably say this is why it's so important to look at multiple years, multiple locations of data, because in research you're gonna have weird things happen. And so I would somewhat argue that some of those trials that are showing a negative yield response, that's probably just due to some other variable in the plot. I don't think that the case is for all of those that the fungicide is causing some sort of yield drag there. I think that's probably just the nature of research, and that's again the reason why we want to look at this huge data set when we're making decisions and not just one little strip out in the field. That's why. So.
I agree. I think, you plot just about anything and you wind up with a piano graph that has some bars below and some bars above. It doesn't matter what the practice is. We seem to come up with these kind of patterns. And I think just like you said, it goes back to, you want to make sure you have a good pile of data, and it's a very good thing. Bex has 20 years worth of data that we've been looking at, because you can see the overall trend rather than these one-off, maybe something else happening in field circumstances.
The other thing I think of that could be at play, all those trials, majority of them were applied with a ground machine. And I do think there is a little bit of crop response to rubbing on the belly pan of a ground machine, wheel legs running right by the ears. And if you have a trial that is very, as far as the fungicide goes, just a 0 bushel gain or a 1 bushel gain, maybe that effect on the crop takes a little bit out of it. So my head's kind of there, or maybe Andrew ran over some corn.
Yeah,
it's been done.
We had one more here sneak in here right at the last. Dave is asking, is a fast fertigation pass of 1/4 of an inch of water an effective option to apply fungicide at VT?
Dave, you're in luck. Just like your name says, you're in luck, because we haven't done that trial yet, but I've got 2 scheduled. If everything goes as planned, we're going to compare irrigation with 1/4 inch of rain with a fungicide to irrigation alone, and then compared to a drone. I don't have those numbers yet. I don't have experience. Where I live, irrigation country is 10 miles from me on the other side of the Illinois River. I hope we pull that one off for you. Matt, you got anything you want to add?
No, I think stay tuned is the best answer to that one, rather than us shooting from the hip.
It looks like from here we have dried up on all questions. Again, I just want to thank all three of our presenters today for taking the time to do these webinars. I'm starting to hear a lot of tasseled corn and starting to get some beans into the reproductive stages. So that fungicide timing is coming very, very quickly. Also want to thank everyone that joined this call. I think we had close to 140 people that joined this webinar. So just want to thank every single person that joined here. And then if anybody is interested in chatting, having a personal conversation with with our presenters, each one of their contact information is in the PFR book. Be sure to check that out. They are always available. And then any agronomic documents that we have, whether that's the spray pass that Clayton talked about, or a nitrogen guide or a herbicide guide, all of those are online. And if you guys would want a physical copy of one, those are, if you get with your local Bex representative, they can get you a physical copy. So again, just want to thank everybody for joining this. Thank you for our 3 presenters, and we hope everyone has a fantastic rest of your day and an even better weekend.